This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include John Hood from the John Locke Foundation, Cash Michaels, one of our favorite journalists in North Carolina with the Wilmington Journal and the Carolinian, Doug Raymond, political consultant from down in the eastern part of the state, and Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch. Well, this week we're going to discuss a couple of court decisions that impact our state, including one affecting November's elections and another that puts a further delay on replacing the Bonner Bridge on the Outer Banks. We also want to talk about a special provision in the recently passed budget that might endanger enrollment growth funding in public schools. And as always, we're going to ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. It's a full show. Let's get started. U.S. District Court Judge Thomas Schroeder denied a motion by several plaintiff groups who wanted to hold November's elections under our old election laws until the courts could finally determine whether the new laws passed in 2013 are constitutional. The judge said the groups had failed to show they would suffer irreparable harm if the new laws were used. Now, plaintiffs said the new laws would reduce the turnout of minorities, elderly, and students, voters that considered by many to be likely to vote for Democrats. Chris, granted this judge didn't rule on the ultimate case itself, only on the move to get an injunction, but isn't the charge of irreparable harm sort of at the heart of this lawsuit by the League of Women Voters and the NAACP?
Well, it is, and it disproportionately affects certain segments of the population. I think the judge's ruling was a disappointment to the plaintiffs, but I'm not sure for folks who were in the courtroom every day, reporters and others, it was a big surprise from the questions and the way that the hearing went. Now the case will still have a full trial. This case isn't over, and I think it's probably likely that it will be appealed. There's two things going on. One is a legal argument, which was difficult to make in this courtroom with this judge. The second thing is the actual the practical nature of what happened. I mean, it's not a secret that the Republicans wanted to make it harder for Democrats to vote. They didn't want to make it harder for everybody to vote, and they didn't want to get fraud out of the system, where they would have done more with absentee ballots, which every survey shows that's where the fraud is. So it's a politically motivated decision. The question is it unconstitutional? This judge initially said not enough to stop it, but I think we're going to hear a lot more about it as it goes through the courts.
But Doug, if this judge can't find irreparable harm, what gives the plaintiffs reason to hope that perhaps the court itself will when the cases are heard next summer?
Well, I think next summer, you got to remember what's been making headlines is the photo ID provision, and that doesn't kick in until 2016, and I think that's where the battle's going to be. But a point I want to make, and I think where the real problem that we're going to see in this upcoming election is going to be the provision on provisional ballots, that you cannot cast a provisional ballot outside of your own precinct, and that's
on election day.
On election day, that's correct. And that's going to hurt people across the board, because what's happening with early voting, so many people have gotten used to going to the early voting sites, and many times those early voting sites are also precinct sites, and they think now that they haven't voted at their precinct in so long, they show up there. If they show up there right after they get off work, they're not going to be able to cast a ballot. They're not going to have time to go to their regular precinct, and they're going to be left out of the voting.
Cash, just so we're clear, it appears most of the opposition and most of the response that I heard following Judge Schroeder's announcement and proclamation comes over the requirement for voter ID. If that provision was struck from the law, if for some reason or another either the courts or the legislature decide to take away voter ID, would all this opposition, would these lawsuits go away?
Well, keep in mind now that prior to the Supreme Court decision last summer dealing with the Voting Rights Act and removing one of the provisions, or striking down one of the provisions, I should say, we had a 16-page law that was pending. The moment that the Shelby case was decided on by the Supreme Court, we had 57 pages all of a sudden that appeared out of nowhere. So it's not just voter ID, it's eliminating straight voter balloting, same-day registration, souls to the polls Sunday voting. I mean, you know, this segment's not long enough for me to give you the list of things that were just simply knocked away for the express purpose of making it harder for those who are traditional Democratic voters to not be able to function properly at the polls.
But John, there are 34 states that have passed these voter ID laws, and the courts recently have ruled in 2 states that the requirement for a voter ID is burdensome to voters. Is there any reason to believe, perhaps, that this court case will come up with that same verdict in North Carolina?
I doubt it. Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled on the general concept of voter ID. The way that the courts have struck it in the past is either because it was implemented too quickly and there wasn't enough time to implement it properly, and so courts, I think in some cases, properly said that this is not something you can enforce in this year. North Carolina avoided that by building a couple of years into it. And then the specifics of the requirement for an ID, that's still subject to some judicial oversight, but the concept itself is not going to be struck down. So I don't think any of the other things are going to be struck down.
So we're going
either.
to go back to the laws that were passed, which will not include voter ID in this election cycle. We used those laws in May very quickly around the table. What was the response? Were there problems?
You know, I didn't see widespread problems, but as I said, I'll reiterate, I think the problem you're going to see in November is going to be the provisionals.
Chris?
Well, I don't think we know. I don't think we saw dramatic problems. There were some sporadic problems, but you can't judge a law by one election. I do want to make one quick point about the voter ID. Ours is very strict, and it doesn't allow you to use other things as an ID other than a government-issued photo ID, which other states have alternatives to using.
John?
There wasn't any effect. There won't be any effect. People who think it's going to suppress the vote are wrong, and people who think it's going to matter the other direction are wrong. It just doesn't matter very much, and this has been studied extensively for something like 15 years. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, is that going to impact the court decision, the fact that
it very much affects the court decision. In fact, this court decision was clearly influenced by the fact that these provisions, most of which make North Carolina like the rest of the country, had no appreciable effect on turnout.
Cash, reactions to May primary.
Yeah, no, this Bush-appointed judge made it very clear that he saw evidence where there could be something deemed unconstitutional in July of 2015 when we go to full trial. He could have knocked this thing down right now, and he did not do it. And yes, there were many people who had problems knowing where they were supposed to vote during the May primary. That was widespread. I do believe I saw that reported widely. So yes, there were problems during that primary, and I don't know how they're going to fix them coming into November.
Well, for those of you saying you'd like to have more NC Spin, I've got good news. You can have additional video content from our panel and other leading opinion makers all on our website, ncspin.com. After each show, we tape what we call the after spin, and our panelists get to tell you what they wish they'd said on the show, as well as give comments on other topics. In addition, we've got NC Spin perspectives posted throughout the week in print and video, so keep up by visiting ncspin.com, and also catch us at NC Spin on Facebook and at NC Spin Tweets. Balanced debate for the old North State. When we come back, the bridge over troubled waters.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
My name is Bernie Teal. Sunburst Farms has been in my family for over 35 years. Last year, I had to do something I'd never done before. Destroy 10 acres of good squash. I wasn't able to find enough workers. The opportunity is there. American families are demanding locally grown vegetables, and I want to provide that to them. So please, tell Congress that we need immigration reform now.
Your family physician supports Medicaid reform. That's good for North Carolina patients, providers, and taxpayers.
For over a year, we've worked with the Governor and the General Assembly on a plan for responsible Medicaid reform.
The Senate's proposed Medicaid changes are a departure from this plan. Changes that could lead to a decrease in the number of primary care physicians providing care in communities that need them the most.
The destruction of our state's medical home network, a network that prevents unnecessary hospital and emergency room visits.
And disregards the elderly, the blind, and disabled, and the health care they need. Care we're morally and legally obligated to provide.
Now is not the time to disregard the progress we've made. Now is the time for lawmakers to implement responsible Medicaid reform that protects and improves health care for all North Carolinians.
Visit rnchealthcare.com and tell your lawmaker to support responsible Medicaid reform.
We now return to NC Spin.
The 2.5-mile Bonner Bridge, the only span connecting Hatteras Island to the mainland, has outlived its useful life and is in perilous condition. The replacement proposed by our DOT was challenged by environmentalists, and a federal appeals court just ruled that the state cannot build the $216 million replacement unless it can prove there's no way to avoid damaging wildlife in the Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge. Doug, you live in this part of the world. What impact does this decision have, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, the longer the delay, the impact is that people are, traveling under that unsafe bridge. I think eventually the bridge will be built. I think the environmentalists' plan of putting in a 17-mile bridge is just unreasonable.
Over $1 billion?
Yeah, over $1 billion. And I did the research. It would be the 4th longest bridge in the United States. I just don't think that's right. The other interesting thing is I think we paint with broad generalities a lot about protecting the wildlife there. And the ones you often hear in this argument are the peregrine falcon, the loggerhead turtle, and the piping plover. None of those are endangered species anymore. They have come back and they're off the endangered species list. So it's not like we're trying to protect endangered species on the island.
Well, what's interesting about this is if we would have done what the DOT and the Army Corps of Engineers and the General Assembly wanted to do in the early 2000s, which was build a longer bridge, it would have been about $500 million and would have included all the parts, a lot of the parts of Highway 12 that are washed out all the time now, which we keep having to fix. So when they say we're going to build a bridge for $250 million, that doesn't include the cost of continuing to fix the road. And everybody agreed on it at that time, except local officials who torpedoed it.
I lived up in the northeastern part of the state for a number of years, and I can tell you that as important as this road and this bridge are to the economy and to the safety of the people up there, Highway 12, John, is the most costly road probably in our state's history. It's constantly getting washed over. Sections are being washed away. Aren't we fighting Mother Nature, and aren't we losing this fight here?
Yes, and furthermore, what do you mean we? The problem here is that when you have a geographic impediment to building a piece of state infrastructure, and that geographic impediment creates a tremendous cost, whichever way you go, the gigantic over-the-top bridge or the shorter bridge with constant reconstruction. Either way, it's a huge expense borne mostly by people who will never use this facility. And we need to think very clearly about this. When you price something below its cost, you're going to get overconsumption. In this case, we're allowing development to occur on the coast and people to traverse the coast in ways they wouldn't do it if they had to pay the full cost of it.
Well, you raise a good question, Cash. Okay. $216 million, it's hard to imagine how our state's going to be able to foot the bill for that. But let's assume that the environmentalists win and ultimately we end up having to build a 17-mile bridge over $1 billion. How in the world are we going to pay for it?
Well, and that's a question that our esteemed lawmakers will have to figure out. I keep hearkening back, though, that when this bridge was built, it was built with folks knowing that it had a shelf life of 30 years. And so that in what...
As is typically the case with most bridges, by the way. Most bridges don't have long lives to start off with.
So when that time frame was up, I don't know what problems came up. I think you mentioned the locals and what have you. I don't know what problems came up, but I think knew then that once they got past 30 years, the clock was ticking. And they had to do something. And you're exactly right. For every year that we wait on this, it gets more expensive. So, we may end up at $1 billion whether we actually want to or not.
Even on the shorter bridge.
Exactly.
Chris, are we looking at tolls here? Are we looking at special taxes? How are we going to pay for all this?
That's a good question. I don't know. There's also bonds and borrowing money and part of a larger infrastructure program. I'm not sure what the answer is.
But, I mean, bonds don't change the funding mechanism. That's just borrowing against a funding mechanism. So the question here is, if people that use this part, that travel this part of the state, if they want to pay a significant part of it directly in a toll, then maybe it makes sense. If they don't, that tells us something.
The argument is, I'm not extolling it, but the argument, of course, is this is a tremendous tax base for the coast. It's economic development. It brings tourists here and helps the economy. That's the argument that you're hearing.
There was another issue that was thrown into the mix this past week. I don't know whether you saw in the news or not, but the state in the budget is proposing that we take over the 700 acres of land, including Oregon Inlet, from the U.S. Department of Interior so that we can widen Oregon Inlet and build jetties out there. Is there any reason to believe the Department of Interior is going to give us that land or sell us that land, John?
Oh, don't you believe in the state supremacy clause?
Yeah, I believe in it, but I don't believe
No, you don't, because there isn't
I don't believe the Department of Interior believes in it.
This is unlike. I don't think this was actually a serious proposal. in the first place.
This may be somewhat rhetorical in nature, but it would be interesting to see how this would be playing out if Mark Bass-Knight and the Democrats were still involved, whether the power that he wielded in that part of the state whether the environmentalists would be a little less fervent in going after it if Mark was still there.
The big deal, going back to my original question, Cash, is fighting Mother Nature. Oregon Inlet was originally washed away and opened up through, I think it was the Ash Wednesday storm back in, I don't know when it was, but anyway. We're constantly seeing the ebb and flow of inlets being covered over and washed out in this. Some people are saying the only way we're possibly going to get this is to elevate the whole road on Highway 12 throughout the whole region, like they have down in Florida in the Keys.
The question is, who's going to pay for it?
All comes back to money.
There are cemeteries of great ideas that nobody wants to pay for. That makes perfectly good sense, but who's going to pay for it?
Final question. Chris, does it make any difference that Judge James Wynn and Allison Duncan, two North Carolinians, were on that panel that made that decision?
Well, they certainly understand it. I'm not sure it makes a difference, and I think this will be in the courts for a while. I think the Republican leadership of the General Assembly and Governor McCrory are clear. They want to build a shorter bridge. They're going to keep fighting for it in the courts, but I think they have an uphill battle.
So we're going to keep closing NC-12. We're going to have to close Oregon Inlet Bridge and run ferries back and forth until we finally...
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, there's no solution in the near future, I would say.
Wow. After these messages, we're going to talk about enrollment growth funding.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Hi, I'm Linda Loveland. I want the best for my kids. Feeding them foods they like within my budget is a priority. But what do we really know about these foods? North Carolina farmers and food experts give you a website to find it all. FeedTheDialogueNC.com, a place where moms like you and me can learn more about the foods we eat and the farmers that feed us. Check it out. Add your input and help feed the dialogue. Let's talk food at FeedTheDialogueNC.com.
The best part about being a member of a Touchstone Energy Cooperative is that it's your Touchstone Energy Cooperative. Learn more about the power of your co-op membership at TogetherWeSave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
We now return to NC Spin.
A growing state has growing enrollments in public schools, and it's always been the case that the state budget would fund that growth. In the past, a school system's enrollment or average daily membership was fixed after a certain number of days after the start of the school year, a process some say is problematic. The recently passed budget contained a special provision that wasn't discussed or debated that will discontinue the process of automatically paying for public school enrollment. Cash, the Democrats are lambasting this provision, say it most certainly is going to increase class sizes. House Appropriations Chair Nelson Dollar, on the other hand, says, of course we're going to fund enrollment growth. We just want to do away with the ADM method for figuring it out. What's your take on this issue?
I think Nelson Dollar doesn't really know how they're going to cover for it. I mean, the formula that we had made sense. You have more seats to pay for, you pay for them. So I don't know what new formula can come up. I hope it's not a formula similar to the teachers' raises thing. I don't know what formula they're going to come up with, but the fact that he doesn't have it at the ready, knowing that school is opening very shortly, and that school systems need to know how much money they're going to get for each and every pupil that shows up. The fact that he doesn't have it ready to roll out, I think, is a problem.
Yes, he does. Okay, this is a story that has absolutely no significance to it at all, and has been blown completely out of proportion. Let me just go a little history here. For decades, the public schools had their enrollment increases built in the continuation budget based upon an early estimate from 20 days into the school year that they then pulled forward to the next year. But for universities and community colleges, they waited a little bit longer to get a more accurate enrollment number, and they made that an expansion item. And this was routine practice. Because the argument was the public school enrollment was more predictable and it didn't matter very much. In 2006, The legislature changed the law to make universities and community colleges funded like the schools, but then during the recession, everybody abandoned it because the numbers were all wrong. Then they reinstated it. Now they're going back the other way. What we're talking about is the timing of when you determine what the enrollment is. Is it 20 days in, which is about what you would need to put it in the enrollment, the continuation budget, which is done in the fall and winter? Or do you wait a little bit longer because there is some attrition from enrollment, you get a more accurate number, and you do it in the spring when the governor proposes his budget? It's all about timing. It's not about funding.
So why doesn't Nelson Dollar say that then?
He has said it.
We did an interview with June Atkinson on our NC Spend Perspectives this past week, and June says that this is really a bookkeeping kind of situation more than it is anything else.
Right.
Of course, what's happened is over the last several years, the projections for growth in enrollment have been overstated.
Yeah.
And so as a result, the legislature had to pull back the funding, which then became an issue because everybody accused them of funding cuts. So what's the right way to do this?
Well, first of all, it's not fair to compare it to community colleges and universities that are much, I think, are much more affected by a recession. If people don't have a job, they go back to school.
All right, take that off the table. That's not the issue.
Right, that's not the issue. I actually think it makes sense to leave it the way it is. It also shows that the budget process is flawed. You had people as highly ranked as Speaker Pro Tem Paul Stam, who didn't even know what he was voting on. I just think it makes sense. He didn't know it was in there. I just think it makes sense to have the enrollment as early as you can. I'd rather have confidence that they're going to fund it, that the schools have confidence, and then trim back.
Doug, what about the accusation this is going to increase class size?
I don't think it is. I think that's a partisan accusation, assuming that Republicans are constantly looking for a way to cut schools, and I just don't think that's the case, and I think this has been a good education budget. But this will strike fear in some people, the thought of this, but I used to be a high school public school teacher in North Carolina, and I can tell you that magic date when the ADM, high schools in particular, did everything they could to keep kids in class, kids that wanted to go to community college, kids that were dropping out, kids that were discipline problems.
So you
kept those rear ends in the seat until that date because you knew it meant money.
Well, I'm sure we're going to be talking about this again before long, because I think this discussion is going to come up again in our legislature. After these messages, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Does your North Carolina business or organization have a story to tell? I'm Richard Campbell, and at Carolina Broadcasting and Publishing, we help tell stories that connect you to the people who will respond. We take the time to understand our clients' needs and what makes them unique. We craft their stories through the efficient use of words, images, and videos that resonate with their desired audience. We also know that a good story is incomplete without a call to action. On video, on air, online, and in print, from concept to final production, no one can help tell your story more effectively or affordably than we can. For special introductory offers, visit carolinabroadcasting.com or call 919-832-1416. Again, that's carolinabroadcasting.com. Let us help tell your story today.
We now return to NC Spin.
All right, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. John Hood, tell us something.
Tom, lots of people have been concerned about media consolidation in North Carolina. We used to have a number of different newspapers owned by different companies, some locally owned, and now 2 companies own the 4 largest papers. McClatchy owns the Charlotte and Raleigh papers, and Berkshire Hathaway owns Greensboro and Winston-Salem. But it turns out, I looked at the circulation numbers and everything, people ought to relax. Even those 2 companies or those gigantic, all those papers they own, it's only about 1/3 of the total print circulation in North Carolina. There's still lots of voices out there, different points of view.
Cash Michaels, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, Governor McCrory has been criticized repeatedly for being very thin-skinned and for using press conferences and opportunities to strike back at his adversaries, bringing cookies to people and so forth and so on. He's going to, as he gets closer to 2016 and considers running for re-election, is going to get some excellent advice as to how to pull back on that, and he's not going to take it.
That's just something we don't know. Doug.
Well, Cash is already talking about the 2016 election. I think a lot of people are. The Democrats appear, the leading candidate appears to be Attorney General Roy Cooper. Now, that's kind of made a domino effect. The Republicans are looking at that Attorney General seat, and right now the name I keep hearing the Republicans pushing forward is current state senator who chairs Judiciary One and is a practicing attorney, Senator Buck Newton from Wilson.
Interesting. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
One of the things I think is interesting about the teacher pay raise, which is the signature achievement, I think, of this Republican General Assembly, is how confusing it is and how it has muted, I think, the political benefit. And it's not just partisan sniping. I think there are people who are generally confused. I'll give you another example. Assistant principals in North Carolina did not get a real raise. They got an $800 bonus. When their pay is determined next year, they go back to what they were making the year before, so they're really not getting a built-in pay raise. It's causing a lot of confusion and strife in schools across the state.
I got one for us this week. There is going to be a technical correction bill that is going to be passed by this legislature that is going to try to correct millions of dollars in expenditures from the just passed budget. Watch out for it. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read our weekly columns, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And we hope you'll join us next week when we'll take on more issues of interest to the people of North Carolina and maybe might have a surprise for you. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.